Welcome to everybody. It's 2:02, and I'm very happy to warmly welcome you to this very first twin lecture on gender, intersectionality, and cultural heritage data. My name is Marek Tamm. I'm the professor of cultural history in Tallinn University and also the PI of the project DIGHT-Net, of which this twin lecture series is part of. And so please just allow me to introduce very briefly the project, give you a bit of context, and then we look very much forward to our first presentation by Professor Julia Flanders and Dr. Lani Hanna. But even I prepared a few slides so that you can better follow my ideas about this project. So we call it indeed DIGHT-Net project, which is a shorter version of a longer official title, Sustainable, Usable and Visible Digital Heritage Twinning for Excellence. It's a twinning project funded by European Commission in the Horizon Europe program for 3 years. And as the title says, its aim is to enhance research in digital cultural heritage studies in Tallinn University with a partnership of 3 other European universities, University of Amsterdam, University of Bologna, and University of Turku. The project was launched last October, so we have already a few months of experience and have organized already quite a few workshops, seminars, and also online events. But briefly describe you the very structure of the projects. As any other European Commission project, it consists of various work packages, which are focused on the one hand on building a digital cultural heritage research hub in Tallinn University, but on the other hand, building 2 digital archives. The first archive of Juri Lotman, the famous semetician of the University of Tartu in Estonia, and the other digital archive of Umberto Eco in Italy from the University of Bologna, also famous semetician and literary critic and author. And we want to consider these 2 archives together. So we are planning to build a digital twin archive for these 2 scholars. And but this is not all. We also work toward the early stage researchers to help their careers, and also want to strengthen research management capacity in Tallinn University. And yeah, just to give you these main focuses of the projects, I'd say that on the one hand, we have 2 more research-oriented focuses. First is to develop the digital cultural heritage studies. We will launch a new course in Tallinn University, a master course on digital cultural heritage, and we will also build a new digital cultural heritage research hub in Tallinn University that will be launched next year. But on the other hand, we want to work closely with these 2 archives, which are unique and belong to project members. The Juri Lotman archive belongs to the University of Tallinn, and the heirs of Umberto Eco have allowed the University of Bologna to manage the archive and library of Umberto Eco. So our plan is to digitize fully the archive of Juri Lotman, and also University of Bologna is in charge of digitizing part of Umberto Eco's archive. And we will build a prototype of the twinned digital archive of these 2 eminent scholars that would be also scalable for other similar personal scholarly archives. But next to these 2 research-oriented focuses, we also work toward 2 more practical aims. The first, as said, is to organize various trainings and seminars and workshops for early stage researchers, doctoral students, postdoctoral scholars. And for this also we organize various on-site visits to our partner universities in Bologna, Turku, and Amsterdam. And fourthly, but not lastly, we want to strengthen the research management, but also open science practices and gender awareness in research. And actually today's online seminar is part of this fourth aim and is related to this aim to raise the gender awareness in research. And we are very grateful both to the organizers of this seminar at University of Turku and also to our two speakers of today. And we have a quite substantial website. So those who are interested in following our events and also materials we produce, please visit this website, DIGHT-Net.tlu.ee. But otherwise, I will not steal more of your time and will happily give the floor to Petri Paju, who will introduce the speakers of today and will explain how the seminar will run out. Thank you.
Thank you, Marek. And also welcome from my part to this webinar of about 2.5 hours, I think it was today. And I'm Petri Paju from University of Turku, Finland, as is Mila Oiva, who is the kind of the second organizer and actually the kind of the main organizer, perhaps, and asked me to do the introductions here. So, but let's go to the agenda of the day, and I want to welcome our first speaker, who is Julia Flanders. She's a professor of practice and the director of the Digital Scholarship Group at Northeastern University, where she also directs the Women Writers Project. And she serves as editor-in-chief of Digital Humanities Quarterly, and has in the past served also as chair of the TIA Consortium and as the president of the Association for Computers and Humanities. So, without perhaps further words, I mean, many thanks for being here, and the Zoom is yours.
Thank you very, very much. I'm going to share my screen, and I'm going to show you my slides. Can everybody see and hear me all right? Okay, great. Thank you very, very much. Thank you to Mila for inviting me to participate, and thank you to all the organizers and those presiding over this really wonderful research project. I'm delighted to be here. It's a great pleasure to join in this conversation. What I'm sharing today is based on the work of the Northeastern University Women Writers Project. And as the prompt for this workshop emphasized, cultural heritage data really reflects and embodies the viewpoints of its creators. And this is true even for creators who are trying to be as reflective and thoughtful as possible, as I hope the Women Writers Project is. So to understand where we are coming from as a project and to put our approaches into perspective, I'm going to start with some background on the project to help situate our thinking here. The Women Writers Project was founded in the late 1980s at the conjunction of several different academic developments. First of all, the end of second wave feminism in the United States, focusing largely on the rights and treatment of white middle-class women. Secondly, the beginning of third wave feminism in the United States with a greater emphasis on race and class and gender as intersectional identities, following the work of scholars like Kimberlé Crenshaw, and also on gender as a performative rather than a purely physical reality, following Judith Butler. And then thirdly, the emergence of what would come to be called digital humanities, although at the time it was still known as humanities computing, and also the beginnings of initiatives to digitize cultural heritage materials on a very large scale. So the intellectual landscape that the Women Writers Project was responding to was thus one in which women's writing was considered scarce, although work by scholars like Elizabeth Hageman and Elaine Hobby and many others was rapidly expanding researchers' understanding of how much women's writing there actually was, that information would actually take quite a long time to filter into the broader academic awareness. And certainly I remember as an undergraduate student in the late 1980s, our faculty clearly had a sense of disturbed consciousness about this. They raised it as an issue. They were like, we know we're supposed to include more women's writing, but, and then there was a long list of buts of why they couldn't do it. There wasn't room, or women didn't write very much, or it's hard to find, or so there was this sense of being kind of on the cusp. The antibodies are circulating, but we don't know what to do yet. So that was a kind of a predominant condition and also a prompt for the project. And in fact, women's writing was quite hard to find in practical terms, especially early women's writing in English before 1850. There had been a wave of good anthologies starting in the mid-1980s, but they were selective and they didn't necessarily stay in print for very long. And the Norton Anthology of Literature by Women, which I'm showing on this slide, quite notably had very little coverage of women's writing before the 19th century. So you can see the proportion in that book. So faculty who wanted to teach women's writing from the earlier periods, from the Renaissance and earlier, had to use often printouts from microfilm or photocopies from rare book libraries that kind of passed around in a sort of subterranean way, like little rare gifts. From a second wave feminist proto-digital humanities perspective, the shape of this problem looked quite clear. We needed to counter the misperception that women did not write. We needed to make that writing more accessible to readers. And we felt that we could take advantage of this moment of mass digitization to ensure that women would be fully represented in the new digital canon that seemed to be about to emerge. And this representation of women in that new digital canon, it seemed clear, would also help us all as scholars develop better, more nuanced approaches to representing texts. And here we're thinking, as part of the development of standards like the Text Encoding Initiative guidelines, because those standards would be able to take all, quote unquote, texts into account, meaning texts by both men and women. So the idea of kind of achieving a cultural completeness of representation was very much in the air and certainly on the Women Writers Project's agenda, and I'm sure that we used that language in early grant proposals. So at the Women Writers Project's inception, we behaved as if woman writer was a category. The Women Writers Project collection was constructed as a kind of supplement, as a space that was as thoroughly women as the canon was thoroughly men. And I recognize how simplistic that sentence sounds from our perspective now, but it definitely was the mentality at the time. And this category of woman was constructed through exclusion. We knew, the canon knew, what a woman writer was because there were a few of them who were notable for being so. So figures like Jane Austen, Virginia Woolf, Frances Burney, Aphra Behn. And also because there was such a strong discourse of their minority and their superfluity and their exceptionalism and the room that they would take up in college courses and in various places. So that sense of separateness, the separateness of the Women Writers Project collection, certainly made for a kind of clarity of mission, and certainly for marketing purposes, it made it easy for us to explain what was happening, what was being done, what the purpose of this thing would be, and why people should want it, both why funding agencies should want it, and also later, once we published the collection, why libraries should want to subscribe to it. Precisely because it isolated gender and made it prominent. And it aligned the Women Writers Project collection and the project itself and the project's mission with other historical developments. For instance, the emergence of academic departments of women's studies in the United States, or the passing of Title IX legislation in the United States that mandated gender equity in educational programs. But it has also risked appearing to essentialize the category of gender and the category of the woman or the female, making it seem monolithic and uniform, so as if there were some great principle of commonality that rose above all other possible principles of constructing the collection, and making it look as if we know what it is or can just tacitly agree on what it is, or worse, making it look as if we could ground the category of woman in biology or in some idea that we know what kinds of bodies these writers had. And to mitigate these risks, the project has over time adopted a much more complex definition of women's writing as part of our inclusion criteria, which includes texts that may have been co-authored by men, texts of doubtful authorship, where we feel there's good reason to believe that the author was female, texts translated into English by women, where the original author might be male or might an unknown gender, texts written by women in other languages and translated into English by men. Those might be a slightly lower priority, but yes. Also things like historical accounts of trials or other events which claim to report women's words more or less directly, or narratives dictated by women to male transcribers, even if it seems likely that the transcription is not verbatim, or texts written under a female pseudonym which have circulated as women's writing, whether or not the author is actually female. And finally, we have a broad acknowledgement that we are speaking here of a culturally constructed concept of gender, and that we can't and shouldn't be treating biological sex as relevant to the task. The aim behind these choices is to give an inclusive cross-section of the written culture as it circulated at the time by authors who represented themselves or were represented as women, with a significant diversity across the collection of theme, geography, topicality, genre, format, audience. In other words, trying to create gender as the grouping phenomenon, and then within the collection, everything else be as heterogeneous as possible. So, for example, we've allowed the inclusion of dictated texts, such as some slave narratives, which makes it possible to include texts by illiterate women who would be excluded if we insisted on a very strict construction of authorship. And similarly, these kinds of historical accounts of women's words, for example, in the context of a witchcraft trial, give a view of women's discourse which would otherwise be inaccessible to us. And texts, similarly in translation, have likewise circulated within the culture of English women's writing, and they represent an important dimension of that culture. The Women Writers Project's construction of a collection focused on women has also skirted, at least potentially, a conceptual problem of organization. As we've learned to acknowledge, at some abstract level, the choice of gender as a primary category of analysis has the potential to affect the visibility and the positioning of other categories. So, as Hope Olsen has argued in How We Construct Subjects, building on work by Elizabeth Spellman, in a hierarchical taxonomic system of knowledge organization, the terms that are chosen as the most salient, so the top level terms, then produce an effect of fragmentation on categories that are positioned as subsidiary or further down in the taxonomy. So there's a tendency to scatter and disperse categories which, if they were elevated to the status of primary knowledge objects, would be seen as unified and important. The Women Writers Project, like most digital projects nowadays, employs a mostly faceted approach to discovery rather than a taxonomical one. So drawing on concepts like Mitchell-Whitelaw's generous interface, that exposes all of the available informational qualities that inform and construct the collection, rather than asking the reader to sort of navigate and drill down through an elaborate taxonomy. And our interface also draws on ideas of rich prospect browsing proposed by Stan Rucker and Milena Radzikowska and Stefan Sinclair, in which interfaces give readers ways of navigating between these large-scale landscape views, such as summaries and visualizations and big patterns, and then more local views of individual items. So that ability to see the generous interface and then shuttle between the big picture and the local is something that faceted searching really helps with. So this is a little screenshot from part of the navigational interface. And even though the terms here are organized into categories and subcategories, that's really only for purposes of making the system clear, but you can actually select any set of categories as facets. You don't have to, they're not mutually exclusive. So in this respect, the Women Writers Project collection's responsibilities differ from those of a library collection. So we're effectively relying on one single category, that is to say gender, to do the work of organization for us, and anything else readers can discover about individual texts is simply a bonus. We're not trying to guide readers to a shelf or a set of call numbers that will contain all items related to a specific conceptual or conceptually unified topic area. And I think that the stakes for our organizational systems, such as the one shown here, would be much higher if we were seeking to support readers in finding systematically items that were relating to one another rather than simply in exploring via a rich prospect browsing interface. And we did in fact face some analogous challenges when considering how to center race in the Women Writers Online collection. So initially we replicated the same mistake that the Academy made concerning women's writing. We assumed that because we couldn't see it, it wasn't there. We thought, oh, well, there are no texts by women of color in the period that we are looking at. Since then, however, we've recognized how incorrect that was, and we've struggled to diversify the monolithic whiteness of the Women Writers Online collection. Adding texts by women of color is an important step there, and this has also pushed us to think along the lines I was describing a moment ago about the category of writing and the kind of collection that we're building. And initially the project in the 80s and early 90s had I would say a somewhat belletristic emphasis on culturally prestigious genres like drama and poetry and fiction. And then, it expanded to genres that were seen as available to women writers, letters, religious meditation, life writing. But over time, scholarship has really caught up to the fact that women were writing across all kinds of genres, including science and periodical essays and philosophy and medicine and history, political pamphlets, many, many other kinds of areas. So in a similar way now, we understand that to find writing by women of color, we also need, again, to go to the places where the writing is taking place rather than making assumptions about legitimation structures that we want to highlight. So for example, we're exploring the inclusion of materials from newspapers and magazines, which originally were categories we had excluded, because those are places where women of color had better publication access. And we're also, again, moving to emphasize dictated texts, such as some slave narratives and historical reports of women's words. And these expanded definitions of women's writing make it possible to include texts by a much wider range of women who might have not had writing literacy, or women who situationally may have lacked autonomous access to the apparatus of publication and authorship, and to the circulation of monographs. So making sure we're finding women's writing in interstitial places as well as in the sort of most culturally prestigious places. These strategies have helped us expand our representation of women of color, but they've also required us to think carefully about what that category means. And as before, just as women initially was a way of identifying what was missing from the male canon, so women of color, that phrase initially worked for us as a way of identifying what was missing from the white canon. But when thinking about how to bring that dimension to visibility within the collection, we encountered challenges. Of course, Blackness and color it's not a uniform or simply differentiable. It's not a property that behaves that way. And for that same reason, for the same reason that we can't talk about the physical bodies of our authors as being those of biological women, we also can't ask these authors about their race, about their experience of Blackness. And we can't use that kind of information in our decision making. So instead, we have to think about self-presentation and the perceptions and positioning that we find in the contemporary environment. So we need to understand race as a constructed and representational phenomenon, and we have to look for the places where it is being constructed and represented. And as a result, we're choosing not to surface race as a simple facet of metadata, a subcategory of the collection's women that could divide the collection into text by women of color and text by white women, even though in many ways that would serve some practical purposes, like making it easy for readers to see how that category is burgeoning, or making it active as a category of analysis, for example, when people are doing searches, word searches for specific words. When we've discussed what it would look like to center race as an intersectional concept, we've focused instead on the possibility of marking and surfacing self-description, letting the texts themselves speak about how their authors imagined their own positioning and how others described that positioning. And this is in ways that are analogous to our representation of gender, drawing a fairly capacious line around the furthest edges of a very, very messy concept, and then letting the texts provide whatever forms of evidence or self-representation they choose. So what does this all entail in practice, and what does our data actually look like as far as the representation of gender is concerned? The biggest and most carefully designed presence of gender in Women Writers Online is just the broad criteria of inclusion, which I already described. But as that manifests in our data, I'm going to show a few examples of some metadata encoding. We represent the gender of the author in the publication metadata for the Women Writers Online text. So the example from the title statement in the upper left of the slide, we record the gender of the person as a kind of typing on the personhood of that author. In this case, we don't know who the person is, but we have established, or we have established to our own satisfaction, that they are female for purposes of the project, and so we give them a type. We give their person name the type person, female. And that has a really practical impact, which is that we can draw out of the text base the components of texts which are by women, in contrast to the components that might have been authored by men. We don't represent the gender of the people that we've identified as the authors of the source document. So that's the second example on the lower left. So that's an excerpt of the description of the artifact from which the text is taken. And you can see that there are responsibility statements that describe the role that person had in the construction of the text, but we don't say what their gender is in that place. Instead, in the third example over on the right, we have what we call a personography entry for each author. And there we are able to record a much more detailed account of what we know about the author. So their name, their gender, birth and death information, where they lived, potentially languages that they knew, things like that. So that's really where gender data kind of shows up in the collection's metadata. And that's not information that we surface in the Women Writers Online collection interface, although we could, and perhaps in the future we will. Here's another example. Sorry, let me start that sentence over. Yeah, there's, I think, often considerable complexity about the roles of people in the collection. So here, this is a bit of metadata from a scene that John Denham wrote to complete a play by Catherine Phillips, who translated the original work by Pierre Corneille. So we have sort of a multi-layered, kind of collaboratively authored thing, and we're trying to account for all of the identities that contributed to it. And each of these people can then, the ref attribute, like P Corneille.tbp, et cetera, that will take us to a personography entry, which says more about the gender of each of those people. So this emphasis on complex, constructed, shifting, and intersectional representations of identity contrasts strongly with what I might term a kind of naive data perspective, which I think is strongly invested in a theory of data as governed by clarity, completeness, consistency, even while perhaps acknowledging that in some cases there may be missing information. And the naive data perspective also, I think, is strongly invested in categories with clear edges, even while potentially acknowledging that one needs to be, smart and sensitive in constructing those edges. And the naive data perspective, I think, is also strongly invested in the idea of there's knowledge to be had, right? There's information out there, and the research value of that knowledge means that it is a primary good, that we should have that knowledge and we should clarify it and formalize it as data, rather than considering the costs or the byproducts of the search for that knowledge and the effort of representing it in clear, hard-edged, data-like ways. And as I look back on the Women Writers Project's history, I think for a long time we were pretty clearly operating or aspiring to operate in that space of naive data. But we could already feel the resistance in the material, and we could appreciate that resistance even though we hadn't really made the epistemological shift necessary to understand the resistance as central rather than marginal. We hadn't gotten to the point where we could see that the resistance to this form of clarity and formalism was not just a problem, an obstacle, a challenge to be overcome, but was actually the central issue, the thing that was most interesting about what we were trying to do. And we wanted women's writing and its evidence to help complicate and nuance the data model we were helping to create, but we didn't yet feel that it could call into question some aspects of the very enterprise of data modeling. And Catherine D'Ignazio and Lauren Klein, in their wonderful book, Data Feminism, articulate this tension really aptly, as they repeatedly note the kinds of formalisms that data modeling and data collection depend on are risky. They privilege dominant categories and the social entities that conform to them, and they put edge cases and entities that are situated at the borderlands into certain kinds of peril. But these formalisms are also, in some cases, what makes it possible to reclaim and empower those marginalized and vulnerable identities by documenting historical realities and historical harms, by showing patterns of violence and invisibility, and by demonstrating the need for systemic remedies. And they offer examples of good practice from projects like the Colored Conventions Project that have been exceptionally thoughtful about approaches to data collection and data modeling and usage that seek to avoid those risks while nonetheless harnessing the power of formalisms and data aggregation. As I reach the end of these reflections, I want to shift gears here for a moment and consider the question of how cultural heritage is represented in a collection like the Women Writers Project's. The early conception of the Women Writers Project collection was also somewhat abstracted away from the idea of cultural heritage or cultural memory. We were coming from a literary history perspective, and also the project had a strong pedagogical emphasis, which tended to seek to decontextualize works, at least from their material context. And we were also, to a certain extent, coming from a tradition of scholarly editing that is interested in works rather than in documents. And in this context, the digital the concept of the digital proved to be a very important complicating factor, because by calling medium into question, by making it a visible primary issue, and making representation an open strategic problem being tackled by, for example, the development of the text encoding initiative guidelines, the digital forced us to think about medium in all other spaces, including the medium of the book or the medium of the circulating document object. So the Women Writers Project very early on took up the question of what our representation of texts should be. And first of all, what is the thing that we are representing? Is it an abstraction like the work in the highest level sense? Is it a physical object like a book? Is it a system of related physical objects in the manner of an archive like the Canterbury Tales, the massive Canterbury Tales project? Is it a system of related abstractions in the manner of a variorum edition, like the New Variorum Shakespeare? And then what aspects of the source artifact should be represented? What is pertinent to the study of this material? Just the literary content, the poems themselves, the dramas? Or do we include the paratext, the introductory material, even if they're not by the author? Do we include things like advertisements and indexes and colophons? And do we include information about the document's own physical manifestation, things like pagination and columns and typeface and, damage and things like that? And for a set of reasons that were not as teleological and clear as they might now in retrospect appear, we decided to treat the text like an archival object, a cultural memory object, rather than operating strongly within the regime of traditional scholarly editing. So we decided to transcribe the full text of the whole document, including materials not written by the author. And we decided to retain materials such as pagination and signatures and handwritten annotations and damage. And we decided to intervene only minimally in the evidence presented by the text, and to do that using digital markup to preserve the original reading in parallel with our own amended version. And this approach is now pretty standard and pretty uncontroversial, in large part because the encoding practices that are supported by the TEI guidelines make it so straightforward to do that. So what began as a kind of research problem in the 1990s is now sort of well-established practice. We also decided to treat the digital archive as a representation of a physical artifact, but also as the focal point for an informational field that makes sense of the text's contents, including things like bibliographic references, references to people, representation of the document's structure, the way it positions itself in genre terms, the kinds of allusions that the text makes to other documents. And this proved fortuitously valuable as our approach to the question of gender construction became more nuanced. As we came to grips with the fact that we couldn't treat woman or person of color as a physical fact, we could instead shift ground and focus instead on self-description, and also on how these texts constructed and presented the identities of their authors as people writing as women, as people writing as people of color, as people writing as members of a working class. And this is where the perspectives of cultural heritage and memory come in, and this is where the expertise they provide is really important, because so much of this information comes precisely from paratexts, bibliographic data, etc., information that is contextual rather than literary. So we, here are a few examples of the ways that texts are sort of explaining themselves, presenting the identities, the complex situated identities of their authors to readers. And we can see, how did these texts and their authors pass in society? How did they construct themselves? How were they constructed by readers or by subsequent authors as part of their literary tradition? How are they presented by people who wrote prefatory materials or who framed the work through title pages or letters to the reader? What was the role that they sought to play or were given to play in terms of race or class or regionality? Or religion, for example. And it's important to note that this doesn't mean that we take these constructions as more true or as giving us access to some gender or racial truth about how these authors lived their lives in the way that, modern psychology positions us in relation to identity. But they give clues about it, and they sketch in the ways in which these authors passed in the world and how they were perceived and received and what they could and couldn't do, and the intersection of their agency and the cultural regimes within which that agency operated. So turning at last, very long last, to the hook that I provided in my title, the idea of gender as Capta, I'm referring, of course, to Johanna Drucker's foundational article on data and Capta, which proposes that we shift from a focus on the givenness of data to the takenness of data representation, constructed as an interpretation of the phenomenal world, not inherent in it. And the texts in Women Writers Online provide complex, intersectional, historically distanced, and in some cases, deeply mystified representations of gender. And the Women Writers Project cannot treat these as data, as having any kind of givenness, but what we can and must focus on is their representationality and the work that they do in constructing an understanding of gender in very situated and very historically specific and changing ways. And with that, I'm going to say thank you very much for your attention, and I look forward to questions and discussion and to hearing what Lani Hanna has to say. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Julia. Should we have like a really quick question if there is any, and then have a short break because we had that scheduled, and then take Lani's presentation. I mean, since we have scheduled this short break, let's take a really short break for stretching, and people can think about questions and then go to questions at the end of the talks. And it's my pleasure to introduce our second speaker today, Lani Hanna, who is on the faculty at the Department of Arts and Culture at the University of Amsterdam in Global Arts, Culture and Politics. And she holds a PhD in Feminist Studies at the University of from California, Santa Cruz, and with an emphasis on critical race and ethnic studies there. And her most recent co-edited book is called Armed by Design, Posters and Publications of the Organizations of Solidarity of the Peoples of Africa, Asia, and Latin America. And it's with Interference Archive and Common Notions Publishing, out this year. So that's for a very short introduction, and please, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. And thank you, everyone. Thanks for the invitation to speak today at this workshop. I was really excited to shape a presentation around the prompt for the workshop today because there are several sticking points in it for me that have influenced some very recent collaborations, and I appreciate the opportunity to workshop them here today. I should begin with a slight caveat, which is I do not believe my presentation today will offer actionable advice as suggested in the workshop series description. I do, however, hope that with my reflection on the prompt and through some examples I'm working through to offer insight into some ways that the space of the archive continues to provide me with deeply ambivalent perceptions of the digital sphere, cultural heritage, and archives. That's what I'm going to work through here today with you all. In this presentation, I will workshop research I'm developing in conversation with colleagues in the US who are critical historians of digital infrastructure. And I aim to lay out a few stakes of examining ambivalence in digital archival spaces, which creates a generative tension to the common perceptions that the digital archive is accessible, lasting, or progressive. And I'm thinking with the late cultural theorist Lauren Berlant's work, where in their last book, they aim to, quote, return ambivalence from its association with the negative to its genuine technical state of intensively clashing aims. So this is the definition of ambivalence I'm using today.
I'm sorry, Lani, but we are seeing still the first slide. So if you, I don't know if you changed the slides, but we are still seeing the first one.
No, I didn't change the slide.
Okay, sorry. Yes,
That's
I'm
okay.
sorry.
It's going to be here for a minute. That's okay. The ideas that I'm going to briefly present today, I've been developing at different stages of my own research on counter-institutional archives as sites of critical social and political infrastructure. I will introduce you briefly to some of the themes in the research I've been doing for the last 15 or so years, and then expand into questions that I've been developing in the last few years through the act of translation, making my work legible transnationally, but also more recently in responding to increasing and alarming conservative attacks on information from the US government. So to start, let me introduce myself through the archival space I'm most associated with, Interference Archive in New York City, shown here in this slide, behind the title. It is a physical archive of social movement material culture in Brooklyn, New York, with a very limited digital presence, but not none. And what I mean by this is that the collective has yet to put significant labor towards digitizing parts of the collection, and the catalog itself is regularly unavailable online for reasons that mostly have to do with labor and capacity of an all-volunteer staff. The collection is accessed through in person through our open hours, and much of the collective focus at this point has been meeting the demand of the physical space. We host course visits, researchers, publications, exhibitions, and events. Interference Archive is a regularly growing and shifting collective, and I would not say that my thoughts on digitization are held by everyone involved. However, digitization has never been a primary focus of the archival collection, collective. So in my own research, I have not generally taken the position that digital archiving is a form of broad-based accessibility for a number of reasons. Primarily, I curate my archival work through preservation through utilization, an approach we take at Interference Archive, coupled with my own research on the development of counter-institutional archival spaces as social and political infrastructures for movement building. And while I think there are plenty of ways that digital archival projects can and do fall into this category, and here I'm thinking particularly back to some of the examples offered of digital activation of collections by members of this research group in Amsterdam in January, I think was when we had a seminar in Amsterdam. I have not personally chosen to invest my time or labor into the digital sphere, a lot of it. So I'm just setting this caveat. As we've seen today and at other points in this research collaboration, there are many creative forms of digital archival spaces doing work. And as the abstract for this workshop describes, to address the lack of representation across gender, race, ethnicity, sexual orientation, and language, or to use the shorthand that is currently under attack in the US, the geopolitical context, which I will mostly draw from for this short presentation today. Many of these digital projects work as correctives for diversity, equity, and inclusion, or DEI, in cultural heritage data. Without fail, even when not presenting at an explicitly digital archives conference, this presentation today notwithstanding, the first, second, and generally third question after I present on print, exhibition, and public event work that I do is always, have I considered making the work digital for more accessibility? For years, this question has perplexed me because it is quite simply not the work that I do. However, the continued recentering of the question of the digital has also given immense clarity as to just how much general investment there is in the digital space as a site of imagined accessibility and even for many long-term preservation. Okay, so now I'm going to the next slide. So responding to the imagined idea of digital preservation, I often point to many forms of obsolete media that line the shelves of the archival spaces that I work, and the labor and tools it takes to keep that data accessible. I've also pointed to the Internet Archive's Wayback Machine, which is a crucial archive of born digital material and websites that of websites that are no longer live. And I will not go deep into the debate about digital longevity here, because considering this is a Zoom full of digital archivists well-versed on the topic, I think. But what I wanted to point to this article about the archiving work to capture web pages being censored by the Trump administration was the author's desire to inform the general audience, that online content is vulnerable to loss. The author's need to spell this out reveals the common perception of the digital sphere as a lasting space, allowing this moment of censorship in the US to reveal vulnerabilities and attachments to digital archival infrastructures that many did not even realize they had. For the remainder of the discussion, I will lay out a few examples of recent digital censorship, somewhat tangentially related to what might be defined in this grouping as digital archives, that reveal for me critical ambivalences of the digital space as a site of potential for archival accessibility and longevity. I will frame this through my recent collaborations with researchers in the US whose work looks at the ideological foundations of the internet, and at least primarily in the geopolitical context of Silicon Valley, and at least primarily in the geopolitical context of Silicon Valley, or as my colleague Erin McElroy more aptly calls, siliconization or Silicon Valley imperialism. So in the US, with DEI under attack, including with some irony, the language of cultural heritage by a plan, Project 2025, laid out by none other than the Heritage Foundation, it might seem counterproductive to do anything except try to make a case for the importance of online data repositories and advocate for continued expansion of diverse representation in these platforms. However, I turn to Roland's formation of ambivalence here to stay with the pressing question of how we have arrived at this point of where, on the one hand, digital infrastructures are imagined to be both inevitable and progressive, and therefore funded and siphoning immense amounts of labor and material resources. And here I'm also nodding to the water use of AI that is desperately impacting already drought-impacted communities, many of whom also find themselves at the intersections of representation, gender, race, ethnicity, sexual orientation, and language that I was asked to address here today. I say this not to set a hierarchy of needs, but to point to the fact that the ability for the digital to market itself as outside of the structures of physical infrastructure is readily apparent in the archival world, where digital archiving is often billed as a solution to austerity measures that threaten the upkeep of physical archives. And as I show here, a major hit to the digital repository of information was the removal of mentions of climate change into the US Environmental Protection Agency website, a move that I believe, along with many, has the potential to exacerbate extreme inequity of drought impact and other disasters that threaten the lives of millions of humans and non-humans alike. When I was first asked to translate my work, which is undeniably on archives, into the European context, when I moved to Europe, I was immediately asked to frame it within the context of cultural heritage. Because I work on archives, the primary problematic from my positionality as a US American scholar of European descent, meaning white and from a settler colonial context, is that I do not personally use or identify with cultural heritage as a way to describe my work. Cultural heritage for me has always had two reference points in the US context. The first being for Indigenous communities in the Americas, for whom cultural heritage is both a critical aspect of community decolonization and knowledge production, and sites of extreme colonial violence and plunder. And the other common use of the term cultural heritage comes from conservative and ultra-right who tie cultural heritage directly to the colonial institutions that maintain the US nation state and mobilize the inheritance aspect of heritage to both property and ideology. So while I'm aware that there are important discrepancies between the invocation of cultural heritage in the European context and in the US context, and those differences get more and more compounded outside of these sites, I'm interested in the moments of slippage when some of the colonial logics that are readily apparent in the US context become clear through political maneuvering. This is often tracked by archival scholars by what is or isn't archived, but in thinking about archival research and infrastructure, I expand these questions into how we must frame the work we are doing in order to get it funded. And I saw Julia also speak to this a little bit, which was interesting. So
important to show with them.
I'm gonna, no, I want to do this. How do I get that to play again? I'm gonna play this video. No, I'm not. If I can.
To show with them. And I think this initiative is very important. And I hope you remember the short story of Hans crying about the interest in his work, because he knew there are people who are interested in the cultural and almost also economical, maybe, but in the cultural impact, the cultural position of designers. And I think that's the main argument why we have to be aware of archives, why we have to do our utmost to keep them and to show them and to tell politicians and all the people, this is us. We are going to have a new government. And apparently they don't like art, but they do like heritage. And maybe that is the card we have to play, not because of the heritage itself, but it strengthens the position of the discipline we're interested in, design and designers.
So this is a video clip from Timo de Rijk's keynote last year for the Living Archives Symposium at the New Museum and New Institute. And it was a beautiful talk. The talk was about a design collection that that he was a part of putting together, and then and that was amassed by the Design Museum and an important contribution to archival discussions. But I showed this clip because it references that there are also complex perceptions of heritage at play in the Dutch context. This important and seemingly offhand remark of de Rijk points to the ideological and political relationships that shape funding of heritage projects. Coming back to my introduction, where I explained that my own archival work has been primarily print media, not digitally focused, to offer another anecdote, I recently gave a presentation in Amsterdam on a new book I co-edited, which was mentioned in my introduction, which is full of materials that circulated primarily before the invention of the internet. And the book itself looks at the legacy of print and graphic design and publishing in this mostly pre-digital era. The book is a physical book, and at the end of the talk, a colleague and friend asked whether I or Interference Archive was working to digitize the collection, or if I could speak to how my work might shift in the digital context. My first answer was simple. It's not a digital humanities project, but one that is aimed very much to think about the distribution networks pre-digital. My second answer was that in the years of developing the book, funding resources for the project became scarcer and scarcer because all of the previous grants that we had received before the project began to stipulate digital components that this project did not aim to complete. My colleague then asked me if it was possible to write grants with the digital component and then find ways to work around it. The short answer was, of course, yes. And the long answer is, when my own research aims to analyze what kinds of imaginaries are available based on the forms of social and political labor we have capacity for as a collective, then adding the task of misrepresenting your own work and adding initiatives that meet grant stipulations rather than your own objectives is to me an expenditure of political labor that is not conducive to the collective well-being of your work. At this point, let me just say again that my own research sits at the nexus of archival studies and critical infrastructure studies. So this anecdote and the turn to funding is allowing me to articulate my interest in ambivalence, a glitch, as I turn to Berlant again. Quote, austerity policies are witnesses to the glitch of this moment, and as are the anti-racist and anti-xenophobic movements across the globe, insofar as they define the present not just as unjust, but as a scene shaped by the infrastructure breakdown of modernist practices of resource distribution, social relation, and effective continuity, and that includes with communities of solidarity from the nation state to the grassroots, end quote. Thinking with funding, or the lack of, can help me track political ideology of digital infrastructures, specifically those out of Silicon Valley, and how it goes that it has become hard for people to imagine an outside of digital infrastructures or information management. Finally, it brings me to thinking about gender, which was, of course, the prompt for this workshop. I've been collaborating with Becca Lewis, now at MIT, but who completed her PhD at Stanford, tracing the nexus of masculinity and the social conservatism in Silicon Valley at the dawn of the internet. Lewis crucially traces the ideological formations of the digital sphere and the development of the entrepreneur as the archetype of tech masculinity through specifically the tech enthusiast and socially conservative writer George Gilder, who used his influence in right-wing media to create an extremely effective nexus of what is called reactionary futurism, as Lewis describes. Quote, George Gilder came to embrace a fusion of male supremacy, free market capitalism, and information technologies. As new digital technologies continued to emerge, multiple institutions with which Gilder worked became increasingly oriented towards reactionary futurist ideas and towards each other. End quote. These institutions have become under increasing scrutiny, and of late, as it have, under increasing scrutiny, and as of late, as it, I'm struggling with my words. Sorry, these institutions have become under increasing scrutiny of late, as it heavily influences the larger entrepreneurial class of Silicon Valley, some of whom are making major headlines today. Peter Thiel, former CEO of PayPal, president of Palantir, billionaire mentor of US Vice President J.D. Vance. Thiel and friends, Elon Musk of X being one, are often referred to as the PayPal Mafia, for whom this reactionary futurist ideology and its relationship to the realm of digital technology, including AI and archival technologies, are very much a part of their political agenda. This is one side of the ambivalence, this meme from The Onion. And while these billionaires and their political agenda rapidly censor digital archives of healthcare information in the name of anti-transgender legislation in the US, or take down a different digital archive daily, 10 PhD postings in the Dutch listings alone use the language of entrepreneurship and innovation as their framework for inviting applicants today, for example. This, of course, means they already received funding using the same language. They wrote those grants within the last year or two. The same languages, logics, and conceptions that created the digital sphere and is currently being used to fundamentally restructure what was once referred to as democracy in the US. I took this opportunity to workshop 3 ways that the prompt reopened a series of questions for me through my own work and collaborations with critical digital media scholars as we try to make sense of our own clashing aims. Those to preserve and make accessible crucial inclusive data, as well as maintain the work of understanding that the logics that produce the tools at hand are the very same that are dismantling them. This is why I could not offer the cruel optimism of successful digital archival examples, except maybe that of the Wayback Machine. Rather, I'm offering Berlin's formulation of ambivalence for us to think with at this moment. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you a lot for a very up-to-date and view of your talk. So we have time for discussion now, and I hope people are preparing them, and you can also type them in the chat if you don't want to ask them yourselves, but please do which way you want. Anyone want to start? Mila, please.
Yeah, thank you both so much for super interesting presentations. I kind of like I think that I would need still kind of like I might have even better and more questions tomorrow, but kind of like these are my first reactions for these highly interesting presentations. First, my question to Lani, kind of like it's you laid out very interesting kind of like field of how you see this kind of like ambivalent data and what is the role of digital in our, both present day and in relation to cultural heritage. And I was kind of like, I think that your point of kind of like the false idea of preservation of digital and how kind of like the fragileness of it was a very good point, and also kind of like the funding and tech kind of like ideologies that play kind of like a really important role here. So but I think that your last point, I was just I wanted perhaps you to elaborate it a little bit more, because if I understood it correctly, did you say that kind of like using the tools that we are now for creating different kinds of digital archives of cultural heritage, so we are using the same tools that are now creating this horrific picture that we are looking at around us. So do you see no hope at all? So or is there a way to kind of like use these tools to create something meaningful as well, or what kinds of like projections of future yeah, so this kind of like I just wanted to perhaps check whether I read you well, and I ask you to reflect on this a bit more. And then I have a question to Julia. Also super interesting interesting presentation, and it's kind of like the longevity of the project and how it has been developing. I really enjoyed the way you kind of like laid out the development of the project, and I started to think that actually kind of like when engaging with these kinds of like digitization projects and kind of like adding materials to these kind of like databases. So I got an impression that as the time proceeded, there was or kind of like, maybe my question is that did there, or did you develop kind of like new kind of understanding also of authorship in a way, and what is kind of like role of gender in cultural production overall? Because it seems to me that starting with the kind of like more simple understanding of gender and adding then race and trying to expand it, it seems to me that there was also kind of like more discussion on kind of like who is author, what kinds of activities are included in authorship and producing like literary texts and these networks and roles, and yeah, so just kind of like yeah, perhaps you could reflect on that a little bit more. Thank you.
I can start since you posed the question to me first. Well, this is why I gave this provocation with these two images that are kind of like, they're not opposites, but there's like there's the parody version, and then there's the headline of like the reality of what the parody is representing. So you have the like keyboard on the barbecue and from the Onion, and then you have the like actually taking down all healthcare information, of all data information on the healthcare websites, which was in the name of transgender health. It took down all gender affirming care information, but also took down all birth control information. I mean, took it down on so much data in kind of one fell swoop. So the provocation I'm laying out here is is multifold, and I am saying this, yeah, I'm not a total nihilist, but I'm not throwing the computer on the barbecue, but I am laying this provocation out here, which is that that these are this is what Berlant gives us with the ambivalence and trying to wrestle it from the negative, but giving the mutually clashing aims kind of back in their work at the end of their life, in the inconvenience of other people. And it's a provocation I sit with all the time. I mean, I think this book is a really important piece of work to try to understand where we are in the world right now. But basically, yeah, I think I am not, I am refusing in this provocation from the abstract to give a successful ways of inclusion in the digital archival sphere, because there was no way for, I mean, I think there's great projects. Like, this is why I nodded to like what people were, giving as options. Again, I have this mutually clashing aims. Sometimes I listen to people talk about the curatorial projects, like some of the talks I heard in January, and I'm very inspired by them. I'm not like I'm not super opposed to the digital or anything. I just think, but I do think that there is a logic that underlies it, and that's what I was trying to pull forth here. That is the same one, that's this entrepreneurial one, and there's this really great work that's been done to show that this masculinist aspect of it, this reactionary futurist aspect of it, that built the digital, at least from the aspect of Silicon Valley. I'm not like a full digital scholar, so I don't know, their internets were built in this network of networks, and so there are like other internet histories that don't have to center the Silicon Valley story. But at least when it comes to what's happening in the United States and this kind of entrepreneurial structure and the way that has funneled everything into this kind of progressive narrative, which does include like the complicatedness that we should hold, this ambivalence I think we should hold of the kinds of labor and trouble that we have to stay with when it comes to critiquing the labor that goes into maintaining these kinds of teleological narratives. So that's the kind of work that I was trained to do, versus trying to rescue what's being completely destroyed in a really quick moment. And I don't want to get in, we've been in the defensive mode for so long, just trying to save what's being destroyed. And I don't want to feel like just because everything's being destroyed so quickly, we're giving over the ability to think about what it is, because I think the fact that we have to be able to look at it critically and maybe not use these tools, they haven't gotten us very far. That's where I am. So yeah, not like totally throwing it on the barbecue, but questioning, and didn't offer any solutions. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I'm just, my brain is abuzz with what you've been saying, Lani, and I so appreciate the way that you've framed these problems. So I think intellectually, fruitfully, and that's not nothing. So there's something coming out, right? I want to pick up one thread, and then I think I can connect it to a bunch of others. One just side note, I think that the question of, I mean, the wonderful picture on your opening slide of people in a space working with things is one that really resonated with me. And the place where I work, the Digital Scholarship Group at Northeastern University, supports a number of different projects, and the Women Writers Project is one approach, which is very much abstracted away from kind of people in places. But others, including the Boston Research Center, focus very much on what happens when very small scale forms of digital activity catalyze work that is still happening in a place by people with their hands. In other words, not in the abstraction that is the internet, but in public libraries, in schools, in conversation spaces, in public buildings, that kind of thing. And I feel as though looking at sort of small digital, right, the way that the cell phone is a point of access for an individual person on a street or in a building to materials that are not there where they are. I think that that's worth thinking about. I mean, there were computers on the tables, I think, even in the image that you provided, even though the people's bottoms were on the chairs next to the stuff. So there may be a kind of a social cyborg kind of thing going on there that's worth looking at. But what really kind of flashed in front of my in my brain as you were talking was how minimal computing has emerged recently, or has let's say has recently become a term, but I think has always been on the minds of a kind of contrarian impulse within the digital humanities. And I really like your word ambivalence, because I think within the digital humanities, there has always been an ambivalence about the costs of adopting the kind of techno-progressivist logic of entrepreneurship and innovation. It's certainly the money has always been with innovation, right? Anybody who has tried supporting projects with grant funding in the United States, at least, and I think it's true in England as well. I don't know how the EU has handled this, although I suspect it's analogous, has found that you can never get money for infrastructure, or rarely, and you can very rarely get money for operating costs. What you can get money for is things like innovation and so forth. And for a while, it's like any bubble. For a while, that feels like, well, there's plenty of innovation to do, so all right, we'll do that. But what the minimal computing flip side of that has always been saying, and they were right, is that A, that's a bubble, and B, that it's predicated on a logic of I almost want to say divahood, but let's treat that as a metaphor. It's the kind of the venture capital entrepreneur that says somebody is going to be catapulted to fame, right? It's a model of kind of it's the digital version of sole authorship, right? That there's going to be a patent, or there's going to be an achievement, or there's going to be an innovation that sort of is, it generates a certain form of kind of incendiary glory, instead of producing the slow, boring, routine, quotidian, this thing is still here and it still works, which does not interest anybody, and it certainly does not interest funders. Now, the thing that ties this for me back to the question of gender, and I loved the way your talk did this, Lani, was that, and I think this also finally gets me back to Mila's question for me about the role of authorship. The minimal computing approach says something much more. Well, actually, let me start that sentence over. I'm gonna pick up the thread of Mila's question. I think, yes, the Women Writers Project has been one of a number of projects, or a sort of a strand within digital humanities, and also I think within archival studies, that is interested in the concept of cultural production as a network of different kinds of agencies, right? Of humans, and also of institutions, and of documents, and of just the ways that things happen, rather than in the ideas of authorship and prestige that animated, I would say, literary studies, and in particular forms of interpretation that are really about authorial prestige. And I think that there's a similar shift in the focus of feminism during the period that the Women Writers Project's trajectory has occupied, away from a kind of mirage of agency and a fetish for, you know, the innovativeness of the author, the brilliance, the originality, right? Being able to situate authors as important because they are original. Or important because they are historically influential, and instead looking at cultural production more as an accumulation of knowledge and action, which is very disseminated and which isn't important because of any one person, but is important because of these cycles of consumption and repurposing and so forth. And I feel like that sort of agency-based approach to literary studies is also kind of the mirage of white feminism, right? White feminism wants to think about free will and agency and the ability of women to have it. And I feel as though what intersectional feminism and third wave feminism and sort of modern understandings of gender have really done is helped us towards a much more complex understanding of how it is to be human in the world. And I think that also translates into how it is to be a document in the world, if that's not too much of a trivialization. And I feel like that really then helps us see the kind of bro-ish techno innovation narrative for what it is, as a fetishization of agency and a fetishization of the kind of the individual glory that is possible when, you know, when you think you have been brilliant, but actually you've just been lucky. So I feel like there's something to work with there. And I feel as though for projects like the Women Writers Project, minimal computing approaches are important, both because they refuse the idea that we can just keep getting faster and better and prettier, and that would be a good thing, that would be a good use of energy or of water, right? Right now, you know, the mirage of glory is for AI, and it's an ecological disaster, and it's I think also, though, interestingly and fortunately troubling ideas of agency, maybe that's a nice byproduct, but I think that minimal computing is the space where we take seriously the idea that we've built this stuff, and now it really does need to survive, and we need to really rethink the economic models around the digital things that we've created, and try to make good on the idea that in some ways they do reach people in places where the stuff isn't. They do enable people with very limited access to rare book libraries or very limited access to archives and to the cultural stuff. You know, they allow it to reach people interstitially and in very local ways. But that's only possible if the pace of change of those digital resources is slammed flat, right? Like, let's not keep introducing new technologies that then we have to keep producing new technologies that consume them. Let's live with what we've built. Let's keep it working. And I think that's really almost like the end of an era. It's the end of it's the end of a bubble, and you just hope that it ends by solidifying the edge of the bubble and keeping it, rather than having it just burst and leave nothing behind. Anyway, my metaphors have totally gotten out of hand, and I'm gonna stop and say, Lani, what do you think?
About feminism like that? Is that what you mean?
I didn't mean to put you on the spot. Just sort of saying, I cede the floor. I would love to hear what others would like to say.
Well, let's see if there's any other questions. But I do think I think that yeah, like as far as agents, I think it's the correct assessment as far as like agency goes. Yeah, totally. Are there other questions? Maybe.
Yeah, are there? Please. Mila, you have one?
I suppose I have a question, if that's all right.
Okay, yes, please.
Hi. Both of you, thank you so much for those presentations. You've given me a lot of food for thought, and it's something that I'm following quite a lot, as you can imagine, at the moment, as I think we all are. In this context, I'm just wondering what you think about the the possibilities of digital resistance, because this is something that we've seen some quite interesting moves that have happened in that space. And of course, whenever we have an archive, whether it be in its physical form or whether it be in its digital form, not that the two are mutually exclusive, they often are sort of hybridized. We also have sort of anarchival practices that emerge from that. And I'm just wondering how this fits into both what you've been saying. And Julia, I mean, I was struck by the sort of the constant sort of reification of categorization that happens. You know, there's a sort of attempt to sort of reify a category by introducing more categories, but at the same time, the voices that are involved in the process seem to be coming from the programming side rather than it being a sort of multi-perspective or, you know, having multiple users that are able to kind of engage with other visions or present them as part of how the identity is being seen by viewers. I had come from an archaeological background, and I guess I'm always very conserved with retrospectively projecting contemporary ideas of identity onto past, whether they be artifacts or texts. So yeah, just some thoughts there. Thank you both.
That is a really interesting question, and I'll pick it up if that's okay, Lani. I think that with a project like the Women Writers Project, one is always dealing the form the project takes is always, you know, the center of a bunch of complex and often sadly pragmatic design choices. And certainly what you're saying, and I appreciate the perspective of the archaeologist. I think that's very interesting and very apt. I think what you're seeing in the sort of the absence of the multi-perspectival, the projection of many users, not just us as a kind of an abstracted paradigmatic user, is true. And it is, I think one of the reasons for that is that it is technically and conceptually very difficult to implement in a way that is satisfying and that produces something that also serves the purposes of circulation, which is sort of our starting point and our bedrock, right? Ultimately, we're trying to be a mediator for materials that we proposed and the public agreed are important for people to be able to read. And the degree of contextualization and description and descriptive formalism that we provide through things like metadata categories and then interface tools that take advantage of those is really, in effect, our attempt to anticipate user needs rather than our attempt to reflect a complex episteme, if that makes sense. I think that there are other ways of imagining a project which would precisely center that, you know, epistemic complexity, and that would be very, very interesting. But that would be a very different project, and one that I think would need to be architected very differently at the most fundamental levels of not just you know, data, but also sort of publication infrastructure and so forth. And that you know, that was just not a piece of the puzzle that we could tackle in pragmatic terms. But I think you're right that it is a limitation of the project, and I think that in the absence of that polyvocality, the best we've been able to do is to kind of not exactly disown, but at least try to decenter the perspective that we offer. In other words, to try to make it as visible as a device as possible. In other words, not to naturalize it, not to elevate it to the level of a grand theory, and also to make sure that users can kind of get past it or get around it as much as possible. So yeah, that's I think where I would go with that.
I think to answer the first part of the question, I think there's definitely a need for anarchiving practices right now. I mean, I pointed to the Wayback Machine as one like kind of place that I think you know, has a lot of import and at least imagines itself to be facing threat. I think it probably is. And then beyond the like book lawsuit that it experienced last year. But then also, yeah, I mean, examples of archives that I think that have done digital archives that have done really amazing jobs of looking of like doing movement. So I mean, I'm part of Interference Archive, and you were right, Julian, pointing out that like what I was trying to point to is the physical space, people sharing space. That was a cataloging party, so it was the like digital component of what we do, and thinking and even doing that in community. So the point of my work is thinking through what it means to have like have and maintain physical space and trying not to lose that in the you know, in the enclosure of the commons as we have been having for, you know, decades and decades. But there's this really beautiful archive called BAKMA. Many of you might know it. It's a yeah, bak.ma. It's a Turkish digital archive of resistance, like online resistance, social movement media. And that's a really great example of a media archive, I think, that does incredible work. So, and they also, the people running it now live in Germany mostly because that's necessary. And so they do a lot of like kind of trying to do some public work and thinking through some of the public spaces and some exhibitionary work. So I think there's different ways that people are trying to take the digital and move it into a public sphere. There's ways I mean, yeah, I think there's if you are doing things digitally, you also have to be in space, because there's just different modes of being in relation, and also that can't be just deleted so immediately. Different kinds of affect that can't just be like taken down from one day to the next. I mean, it's a weird thing to have spent so many years being like, I don't know why people think that the digital can just stay there and like that it's so secure. It didn't even exist, you know, a few decades ago. And then, you know, I don't want to be in a moment of being like, told you so, you know what I mean? When all of this data that we really need, you know, like the abortion access data that people need in like rural Arkansas is gone. I don't want to, it's not nice to be like, well, I've been saying that, you know what I mean? Like, that's like not a nice feeling, but it is true. You know, we need other infrastructures for this kind of data.
Yeah.
And we've been
Well, I think also the emergence of the digital has shown us how valuable it can be to somehow make information available beyond where it is, right? I mean, abortion information wasn't necessarily available at all in Arkansas absent the internet. And then when we take it away, we've created a need, and that's now no longer being met. So thinking about what the post-digital information network looks like, I think, rather than just saying, well, we can now go back to living without it, and we never needed it, and we don't need it again. There may be, yeah, I don't know where to go with that.
Yeah.
I am kind of curious if I could pose a question to the organizers of this workshop about how we might sort of take the provocation that Lani has offered and the sort of historical case study that I've offered, what use those might be to the EU-funded work that you're planning to do on ECHO and on I'm sorry, the other name is not coming to my mind, even though I know it perfectly well because I'm on stage. But anyway, you know, the kinds of work that those projects will be doing, that these universities will be doing with digital archives, and perhaps with also the non-digital archives aspect. Are there themes that have come out here, or ideas that are nascent in what we've said that seem particularly applicable to that work? Or are there questions that we've really just left on the table that you wish we would speak more directly to? Or that might
Yes,
be a
that's
question.
Lotman is the other name. Mila,
Yes, thank you.
you please reflect on this if you.
Yeah, of course we are a larger group, so it's just kind of like only my preliminary reflections regarding your presentations, and I see that there are also other people on this webinar who are perhaps more kind of like knowledgeable about the kind of like the creation of the digital archive process and these kinds of things related to Juri Lotman's archive and this. So perhaps if they want to, they can also share their thoughts. But I think that both of you and both of these presentations kind of like brought really. I think that at least to me, they strengthened some of these kind of like preliminary thoughts that I have at least had previously, especially regarding the preservation thing. We are actually, one of the next sessions that we are going to have is actually related to preservation and sustainability, both from the perspective of kind of like, fragileness of digital archives, but also from the kind of like ecological perspective. What do we do? How do we actually, is it possible to create a digital archive with in a way that takes into consideration the huge amount of energy consumption and kind of like all the devices and these kinds of things. So this is kind of like another thing that we are going to tackle on. But I think that regarding, I think it's too early for me to say but I think that you brought up very interesting thoughts in relation to this like divahood, what you said, and this techno bro aspects of digitality and kind of like how to in a way take digitality back to people, or kind of like and to also and I think that also these kinds of like questions of authorship and how to preserve kind of like human activities and the networks of information production and how to bring that up in a digital archive is something that we also have been discussing. So these are very briefly my reflections, and I don't know if somebody else wants to share some thoughts, but I really enjoyed both of these presentations, and I think that they have, you have brought a lot for us to think about further. But perhaps Hannu has something you want to say something.
Not so much to add, but sorry, I came a bit late today. I didn't hear everything, but I think there are many kinds of aspects that are important. I mean, on the other hand, we need food for thought. I mean, different kinds of points of views. And we are also living in a very controversial age. I mean, the cultural heritage that we digitize and produce, it can strangely be put into another context, and there are ramifications that might be beyond our reach, and it would be, of course, important to consider those kinds of aspects as well. And I also like the idea of minimal computing, because when we are building something new, it's always like starts with fantasizing different possibilities, but on the other hand, we don't know the future circumstances at all. So I think the certain idea of minimal computing might be one of the sustainability issues on the long run. Just a couple of thoughts.
I think it's also really interesting, especially for projects focused on very important central cultural figures who are male, so Yuri Lotman and Umberto Eco, to think about how gender plays into the sort of methodology that one brings. So, it's not perhaps going to be as much of a factor in sort of, basic metadata and things like that, but thinking about the work that's been done on feminist textual editing and on feminist and critical archival approaches, I think is definitely worth doing, especially because as the high cultural profile of those figures will naturally tend to draw the projects more towards kind of traditional, not hagiographic exactly, but whatever the archival version of hagiography is. I think, having maybe taking advantage of Lani's idea of ambivalence, trying to build in a kind of contrarian impulse into the work, even just to kind of keep one's mind open to possibilities.
To go off of what you were saying about kind of trying to bring in white feminism as like a structure of this earlier, Julia. So, I mean, I was trained in feminist studies at University of California, Santa Cruz, which is a very specific type of thinking with gender. It's not like a gender studies program. It closed this year, but it wasn't a gender studies program. But it does under feminist studies then in the way that Angela Davis and Donna Haraway kind of organized the program when they opened it was to take gender as I think exactly as you were pointing to, Julia, as a structure of power to then unravel the kind of way, to start to understand the way that power moves through space, which is more or less the kind of epistemological unwinding I did, placing myself in relationship to the abstract that you gave me, right? Like, what are the things, where did I stick in relationship to the abstract that I was given to do this? I could have said like, oh, well, I don't really do digital archiving work. And so maybe I'm not the best fit for this talk, thank you so much. But I do digital archiving work. There's lots of times I've done digital archiving work. Everyone interfaces with the archive. I've been an archivist for 15 years. Of course, I've done digital archiving work. I also could have chosen some of those examples and tried to like represent them in a kind of representational way, the way that is what's expected of me, most likely. But that's also not of interest to me because it doesn't expand the epistemology either, the way that I'm interested in doing. Does that make sense? So this is again like this is the way gender functions. So when I started to think like, what is the gender of the internet? It's hypermasculinity. That's what's moving, and that is what's moving through the internet and destroying data actually right now. And that can be white feminism, the hypermasculinity of white feminism. It doesn't matter that there's no essential, as you've laid out very clearly, there's no essentialist sex related to gender in relation to the gender of the digital, but it is this hyper entrepreneurial archetype of like the male archetype entrepreneurial masculinity that developed through this nexus of this reactionary futurism. And I think there's some, amazing work that's been done. And now it's really interesting because it's so important. It's so critical. There's New Yorker articles coming out about it. It's in the Guardian. There's like, people are like desperate to find out what the hell is unraveling the United States. It's quite simple. So anyway, that is the way gender functions here. And that's an interesting approach to apply, I think, to building some digital archives about some iconic men. I don't know what would come out of that, but it would be fascinating. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, just a very brief, that's a very good idea. But kind of like with our this digitization project, of course, this is about kind of like central figure right now with kind of like prominent intellectual and so on. But there are kind of like interesting aspects of this. For instance, well, there are also collections of Zara Mintz within this archive who was a wife of Juri Lotman. So there is this aspect that is kind of like we are juggling what to do with this. But simultaneously also the actual fact that Juri Lotman, kind of like coming from Jewish background, he was not able to work in Moscow or in Leningrad, but the actually the one of the reasons that I kind of like how I understand his work is that because he was kind of like working in the margins of the Soviet Union at the University of Tartu, and kind of like in a marginal position in a way. So he was actually able to do super interesting things and maintain also connections to many important, having these kind of like very vivid networks at the same time. So here also kind of like being not in a hegemonic position in certain way was one of the kind of like interesting aspects of his life and what has been able to what he was able to do. So there are all these interesting layers about this. But yeah,
I read the publication you put out. No, I'm not saying apply a critical framework to him in his life, but to the methodology that you're doing to build an archive. That's what we were discussing, I thought, here today. Yeah. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and I think it's also really interesting to think about, I mean, I don't know what forms of digitization you'll be doing and whether you're thinking of, transcribing documents or, representing them in TEI or creating social network data or what. Apologies for my cat who is about to make an appearance on my camera if I'm not careful. But it is interesting to think about ways of producing a digital archive that does not center its ostensible figure, right? And I think, thinking about the other people who are present in the archive is one way of doing that, but also thinking about what else the documents are testifying to besides their association with Juri Lotman or their association with Umberto Eco. So thinking about those figures as almost like just the magnetic field that shot through a bunch of stuff and caused it to be in one place, but now it's still, just the nexus of a vast network of information about all sorts of things, and thinking about what those things are and how to bring them to the surface. Be very, very interesting.
And there are these tensions with the Russian culture. He was a Russian culture scholar, so that kind of brings in these tensions that are perhaps something to think about with your talks today. So we have these dissertation projects that can make use of your talks, since the plan is so we're recording this, and the plan is to place the recording on the DIGHT-Net project website, so people can see it afterwards, and perhaps your slides, if you let us, we can put the slides there, and so it's reusable in that sense. But we are over time, and thank you for not rushing anywhere. And if there are no other questions at this point, then I want to really thank you for these insightful and timely and thoughtful talks, and for the wonderful discussion, and especially Mila for organizing, and yeah, and the audios, of course. So I wish you a very nice weekend, and again, thanks.
Thank you.
thank
Bye-bye.
you. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.